Hello and welcome to World Insight on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Coming up on tonight's program, South Korea's defense ministry installed 4 additional launchers to THAAD without informing their president. How will President Moon ensure civilian oversight over this controversial system? And we will check in with our host Tian Wei, who is now attending the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. She finds out what are the key economic issues affecting Russia and the world. And we start today's show with South Korea's frustration over the deployment of the controversial U.S. missile defense system THAAD. President Moon Jae-in ordered a probe into why his office was not informed by defense officials about the arrival of several additional launchers of the THAAD system.
The new South Korean president is unhappy with the latest progress of THAAD deployment. A delivery of 4 additional THAAD missile launches was not reported to him.
President Moon was briefed on such facts by the National Security Office chief and said it was very shocking. He ordered his senior secretary for civil affairs and the NSO chief to find the truth behind the unauthorized entry of the 4 rocket launchers.
South Korea's ruling Democratic Party Thursday said it will call for a parliamentary hearing on the defense ministry's failure to inform the president. The party's special panel on the issue plans to call upon several security officials to testify. The controversy of U.S. missile defense system THAAD continues in South Korea. A South Korean director produced a documentary, Blue Butterfly Effect, to recall the conflict between residents of Seonju, the location where THAAD is deployed, and the South Korean government. Protests against THAAD in the town have been going on for some time. Seonju villagers are furious over former President Park Geun-hye's unilateral decision to deploy THAAD without consulting them. However, supporters of THAAD in South Korea are still numerous, and President Moon said the investigation was not aimed at reversing the deployment, but to conduct it with transparency. On Wednesday, China's foreign ministry repeated the nation's strong opposition to the deployment, saying that poses a threat to China's security interests.
And more on THAAD. We're joined in our Beijing studio by Victor Gao, who is a current affairs commentator. Victor, and joining us from New York is James Kim, who is a research fellow at the Asian Institute for Policy Studies, and in Washington, D.C., with Ms. Sharon Squassoni, the director and senior fellow at the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to all of you. Let me start with you, Victor.
Thank you.
First of all, what do you make of the growing grassroots movement against the South Korean deployment of THAAD, especially after President Moon Jae-in was sworn in?
I think this is very natural and highly expected. I think there will be very few people in South Korea who want to risk the safety and the security of their own nation and their own country by the deployment of the THAAD missile system on their own soil, mainly because the deployment of THAAD in South Korea may turn South Korea itself into a bigger target, and in any case of war or missile attacks back and forth, definitely not only the region where the THAAD system will be deployed, but South Korea as a whole may become a target, both tactical as well as strategic target. Therefore, I think it's highly, highly natural for the Korean people in South Korea to oppose this.
James, is this just a regional protest, or it represents some kind of a national change of mood towards THAAD?
I'm not so sure that there's a real big change or shift in public opinion about THAAD. If you take a look at the latest polls that have come out within the past month, and also the exit poll after the election, we're seeing between 50 to 60% overall support for the deployment of this capability. Where there is some disagreement, it is with the local people of Seonju who thought that, or who feel very much that the government did not engage in enough dialogue and debate about this particular issue before moving ahead with the decision. But again, this is a relatively small country we're talking about that is highly populated. It's going to be difficult no matter where you choose to locate or place this capability. People will have their opinions, and it just happens to be that Korea is a democracy where this kind of debate is free to happen on a day-to-day basis.
On the latest development of this, James,
very clear,
why wasn't President Moon Jae-in informed about the latest delivery of the launchers? Is there any miscommunication between South Koreans and Americans? What happened?
Well, President Moon has stated that he wasn't informed about this, and so he's called in his Minister of Defense and the National Security Advisor to provide more information on this. But the U.S. position on this has been always that there's been complete transparency with the South Korean government about this. Now, there's some debate within South Korea about the process and the procedure and the steps taken by the previous administration and their interim government as they moved ahead with this decision. Again, the 4 extra launchers, the delivery of those launchers doesn't necessarily mean deployment. So there's some disagreements about exactly what kind of conversation actually occurred between Blue House and the Ministry of Defense about this matter. We'll see in the coming days after the investigation about exactly where the information was lost, or who miscommunicated, and who made the errors here.
And Sharon, what do the government in the United States think about the change of tone from the South Korean President Moon Jae-in about the deployment of THAAD? Obviously, he had some doubts about the deployment. Now he raised questions about the fast delivery of launchers without his knowledge. Is Washington worried?
Well, I think, no, I don't think so. There will be a summit. As a matter of fact, the special envoy is arriving shortly. I don't. There's no real concern right now. These decisions, this is not a secret program. This is, these decisions to deploy the system were made quite a while ago. It is totally understandable for President Moon to be wanting to go slow, right? He didn't, Park Geun-hye was impeached. He didn't have the usual transition time. He's getting things sorted out. And so while, the protests are regrettable and, I don't think anybody wants to see this become a political football, I think we're going to wait and see what happens with the summit that's coming up. And hopefully, both parties will agree that this is something sensible to do in light of the North Korean threat. I mean, South Korea is a target anyway of North Korean short-range, whether it's artillery, short-range ballistic missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles. I do not believe that the deployment of the system makes them a bigger target.
But Victor, do you think President Moon will probably use the protests, increasing levels of protests at Seongju, as a political reason to raise doubts about the deployment, or at least postpone the deployment?
No, first of all, there is no denying that tensions on the Korean Peninsula are very high and the situation is very dangerous. And DPRK is taking actions which are in violation of the United Nations Security's resolutions and refusing to discontinue with its nuclear weapon as well as its launch vehicle. But on the other hand, deploying the THAAD missile is not constructive at all. It's actually making the whole situation even worse, and eventually the consequence may be even worse than without the THAAD missile, and it will make the eventual solution of the DPRK nuclear weapon even more complicated and more difficult to achieve if let's just imagine if Russia is going to deploy the anti-missile system somewhere outside of the United States, either in Canada or in Mexico or in some of the Caribbean islands, do you think the United States will sleep
But the question is, do you think President Moon
Yes.
will change his calculations about security assessment with
Indeed.
the deployment of THAAD?
Yes, indeed. Answering your
Why?
question, I think, first of all, we need to give President Moon more time because he's new in his position as the president. He needs to get all the briefings. He needs to get all the reports about the ins and outs of this THAAD system. Secondly, I think President Moon needs to make a strategic decision as to what exactly is the end game on the Korean Peninsula involving the DPRK threat in the nuclear weapon as well as in the launch vehicle threats, and what is the better way to deal with this threat. And I hope President Moon will realize that going through diplomatic channels, increasing dialogue, including with DPRK, probably will be a better strategy rather than piling up more and more weapons.
And recently there was a film, a documentary film by director Emmanuel Muncho Park. The title is Blue Butterfly Effect, which basically zeroes in on Sonju's anti-THAAD movement. James, what do you make of such a documentary film and the impact it will have on the South Korean people's attitude towards the THAAD deployment?
So if you take a look at the public opinion trends on the THAAD deployment, after the fourth nuclear test and the fifth nuclear test, the support for the deployment of this system was at about 75%, according to the Asan Institute for Policy Studies' own polling. That number sort of came down to about 50%, or about 60 to 50%, between 50 to 60% before the impeachment process and the scandal. Once the scandal broke, the support for the THAAD even dropped further, down below 50% to between 45 to 50%, and until the election. So after the election, when we're taking a look at some of these polls again, it's gone back up to 50 to 60% overall. So why the trend? Well, first of all, the lack of North Korean provocation coupled with the scandal and the Park administration's decisions to move very quickly with the THAAD deployment raised a lot of suspicion about whether the government was thinking in South Korea's best interest. But after the election, you're seeing North Korea continuing to fire missiles and threatening a sixth test. And frankly, I think the South Korean public sees this as a bigger threat than what THAAD might do in turn for South Korea.
Moon Jae-in and his government, before they were sworn in, they were ambiguous or rather opposed to THAAD deployment. After they were sworn into office, do they have second thoughts about their stance on THAAD deployment, considering the increasing frequencies of North Korea's missile tests?
I think the Moon administration found that, well, then candidate Moon and the progressives found that opposing the THAAD deployment would be a very difficult proposition, a political decision for the progressives, given the continuing provocation from North Korea. And so they've taken a different approach after the election. What they've said is that they support the Trump administration's policy of coupling pressure with the possibility of engagement. But with North Korea continuing to move in a very steady manner and continuing to develop their delivery capability with the stated intent and the desire to have a long-range delivery capability, has made this position very, very difficult for the Moon administrations to continue. And even maybe perhaps unwillingly taking on the Trump administration's position that they would like to have more pressure on
Okay.
North Korea,
And Sharon,
then if they're willing, then
there's
possibly
a
engage.
bigger picture.
So
That's
I think this is this
how
isn't a change of a position.
President Moon weighed its relations with both the United States and China. China says it will not tolerate South Korea deploying THAAD. If it does not back down, China will continue its economic pressure. On the other hand, President Moon wants to have a closer relation with China, but also enjoying its security alliance with the United States. How will President Moon balance the relationship with these countries?
Well, that's a very good question. We don't know. I think, President Moon is more left-leaning, certainly, than Park Geun-hye was. The real question is, could South Korea ever rely on security assurances from China? China doesn't like these American ballistic missile defense systems, right, for a variety of reasons, whether you agree with that or not, right? But, it's concerned about U.S. influence in the region. It's concerned about the possibility of the radars in these systems having an effect on China's strategic deterrent, right? I mean, we can argue the technical details and say, when the radars are in engagement mode, that they're not looking at China, obviously. But those modes can be changed for those radars. Of course, it wouldn't be performing the function that you want it to perform in that case. But what would China say if South Korea, which at one point thought about deploying its own missile defense system, how would China feel about that? Yeah, right. This is a balancing act that the new Korean president is going to have to manage. Unfortunately, when you look at President Trump, it's really not clear. His own policy towards the region and towards the North Korean threat is entirely unclear. So that is going to
will be even
some
more
uncertainty.
complicated and very challenging. Thank you very much. We're running out of time. Thank you, Sharon, James, and Victor.
Thank you
for your perspective.
Thank
You're
you.
now watching World Inside, and still to come on our program. My colleague, our host, Tian Wei, who is now attending the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, will find out what are the key economic issues affecting Russia and the world. And I'm watching World Inside, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Next, we turn to Russia, where St. Petersburg International Economic Forum kicked off on Thursday. And CGTN has a special team over there covering the issues and the topics. My colleague Tian Wei will bring you more. Tian Wei?
Thank you, Zhou Yue. Live from St. Petersburg here in Russia. World Insight with Tian Wei team is bringing you a special program from the 21st St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. This year, St. Petersburg International Economic Forum already reached, as we mentioned, the 21st year. This year's forum was opened by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. It has become a platform bringing the emerging economies and the developed ones. Take a look at this.
The three-day 21st St. Petersburg International Economic Forum kicks off on Thursday. This year's forum will discuss the dynamics of the global economy and the new technology carrier. The international cooperation of small and medium-sized enterprises around the world will also be the highlights of this forum.
We found is that this year people feels like there's a desire to get back to business. You know, as you mentioned, there's the Indian premier here, a number of other leaders, the Saudi oil minister, and some of those CEOs that weren't here the last couple of years are back again this year, and they're not here for the weather. So I think people are minded to get into some real discussion of economy and business.
The forum is a major event for St. Petersburg, the second largest city in Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin will meet with the leaders of nations and international organizations, including the EU and the IMF. China and Russia have formed a good tradition of mutual support for each other's large activities. This year, China has brought more than 1,000 people to attend the meeting.
The potential is very big. I think, again, if you look at the last couple of years in terms of historical context or recent history, I think there's no secret that Russia a couple of years ago became extremely keen on developing this relationship with China. And I think Russia was more keen perhaps than the Chinese were to begin with.
Among all the issues to be discussed at the forum, the spotlight will be on the global economy and economic growth after the Russian recession. Seeking more possibilities amid crisis, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is now a unique platform for open dialogue between emerging and developed economies.
Yes, indeed. The St. Petersburg International Economic Forum over the years has become a gesture by Russia to reach out to the rest of the world. At a time of dramatic changes, one of those changes is the increasing role and influence emerging economies are having for the rest of the world. Among them, China and Russia. In fact, 5 of these emerging economies 2 years ago established a new development bank, otherwise known as the BRICS Development Bank. The role of this bank is to provide much needed capital and financial support for infrastructures in these 5 countries, as well as for the rest of the world. On the very first day of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, I caught up with the president of the new development bank, K.V. Kamat. He was originally coming from India. He is very proud, in fact, when answering questions of CGTN about the green bond issued by the new development bank last year, denominated in the RMB, the local currency. Take a look. So how much role, really, can new development bank play?
Well, you know, it's a very interesting question. The role of the multilateral development banks, I think, is changing as we go along. As you said, earlier the needs were very limited, and these banks were expected to meet all the needs. Today, the needs are large, and these banks, I think, are better suited to play a catalytic role in trying to spread the ways in which these countries can access capital. I think that's the role I think we would play.
Maybe it would have the question for you as to what exact projects have you done, and what, in fact, how can people assess your achievements?
Clearly, the focus was on renewable and green energy.
Yeah.
So in China, we did 2 projects which were in the renewable energy space. One was solar, one was offshore wind. In India, we did a renewable energy project. Brazil and South Africa also we looked at where renewables were connected.
Mr. President, that you are going to say we are all partners when it comes to other infrastructure development banks all over the world. But many would say, you know, how can you compete? Because on some of the key and important projects, there is competition.
Well, honestly, you know, I take you back to your earlier submission that the needs are so large. So I would say, where is the competition?
26 trillion, they
say. There is need for cooperation rather than competition. I think competition is unnecessarily being put to the front. As I see, there is no competition. All of us have a role to play to attract money in. And how can we, by working on projects, either by ourselves or together, get others to bring money into the project by giving them the confidence to invest? I think that is the central opportunity and the challenge before us.
But there is something that is very new and unique to the new development bank, because you issued the green bond in the local currency dominated in RMB last year. What does that tell you so far?
I will take myself back to what I said earlier, standing on our own feet. So even when we started, in my very first meeting with the leadership in China, I said we would like to use local currency. And we pushed that agenda by seeking permission to issue a local currency bond, and that to a green bond. And they were very supportive. I can share with you now that everybody now talks local currency. A year and a half back when we started, or 2 years back, nobody was willing to believe it was possible. I think it is possible, it's a scalable model. And honestly, China showed the way. Now, it's not ending there. There's also scope now to work on local currencies between the central banks of our countries. And again, the governor of the PBOC is now a very strong, supporter of the move for local currency for not only investment but also for trade. So just recently, I heard him speak, and we were on a panel, and he said, this is where we need to go ahead in terms of local currency for trade and other purposes. So suddenly the narrative on local currency has gone very high. I think all because of the initiative that was supported by China in allowing us to access the market. So new things are happening, and I think we want to ride that curve as we go along.
When it comes to the New Development Bank, some say, well, it is here to rival the original already existing system, for example, the World Bank, IMF. That is the function of you, and therefore you're threatening them. But others say, well, you are not threatening enough. You should be able to shake up the system. And now you're only replicate what already existed. What would you say to these very different views?
I think let's take a simple thing.
You always see things very simple, isn't it?
Yeah, for example, the existing system so far has basically lent in hard currency. So the very thought that you will do local currency, I think now the system is talking about local currency. I can assure you that in 3 years from now, local currency is going to be as accepted as the hard currency in the financing pattern globally. And I think shake-ups need not be very large eruptions. Sometimes small ripples then build into, I would say, into a very effective medium of change. I think that's what we need to do. And sometimes it is better not to speak too much about some things. Get them going, and then suddenly they will surface. So there are various ways in which this change happens. But to me, the most important thing that the BRICS founders coming together was to signal that developing countries can stand on their own feet. To me, that's the first signal. The second signal is to say that we will use our local currencies also to good measure. So it's I would think, a sequence of things where the next one is to catalyze, others to do what is being thought of and done. And then you will have momentum.
Different development stages, yet these countries are emerging economies. So even on the local currency issue and some of the other consensus, there has to be a process, it seems. How do you, as the president of the New Development Bank, look at this process and the possibility of bringing consensus really at any time, Mr. President?
You raise a very interesting and important point. See, if all were at the same level, honestly, there would have been no excitement. And the possibilities would have been limited because, excitement and challenge is not there. Because they're not at the same level, you have, I would say, a myriad of opportunities. The bar keeps going higher, bar keeps going lower. So you have to be innovative to find solutions. So it's a struggle to achieve. And I think that is happening very well. And I'm very
What are you struggling with right now?
Oh, right now, try to see how do we raise, for example, raise money in China. How do I go about raising money in India? How do I go about raising money in my other countries? How do I get the central banks to get into a local currency, marketplace, as it were? So just some of the challenges. But otherwise, it's a mundane bank building. So we are working on getting the bank a very strong foundation so that build for the future.
That is KB Kamet, the president of the New Development Bank, talking to us on the very first day of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And you're watching our special program, A World Insight with Tian Wei, here broadcasting to you live from the city of St. Petersburg. The world is changing fast. That, you say, might be a cliche, but it's really not if you ask the two gentlemen who are sitting with me here, right here in the studio. They are representing, I guess, the rising stars of the financial sector, and they would help us to understand innovation, the economies of the emerging countries, particularly China and Russia. My great pleasure, Campbell Beswaite, Managing Partner at Finteca Holdings. Welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Tian. Всем добрый вечер.
Well,
good evening
Russian.
from St. Petersburg.
Great to have you, sir. And also, Xu Sitao, Chief Economist and Partner of Deloitte China. Welcome as well, Sitao.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, let's start the conversation. 2% or about GDP growth rate. That's probably Russia is embracing right now. Much better than it used to be. Campbell, you're here for a long time. So, but many say, is it going to be sustainable given there's still sanctions and also the fact relying too much gas and oil still?
The reliance of the Russian economy on oil and gas and natural resources has been an issue for a very long time. The government is actively taking steps to reduce that reliance, but many people would say they're not moving fast enough or far enough in that progress. The sanctions that have been on the country, or the retaliatory sanctions by Russia on food products from the rest of the world, have had some effect on the Russian economy, but there's also been some great advantages. And in my position, where we invest in a lot of startups to help small businesses in Russia, I very much believe that as Russia does decouple from its reliance on the government and natural resources, the opening for small businesses will be very important.
Interesting. Is that an opportunity, rather?
I think Russian economy is on the mend. Recovery is taking place, and you may argue it's still slow. But the reality is the exchange rate now is being viewed as undervalued. Interest rate coming down, and inflation under control. So, I mean, it's definitely the economy is recovering, but of course at a slow pace.
But you know, what does all of this mean? Could it mean more opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises, which is your expertise, I guess, Campbell, because it is only contributing about 20% to the GDP, while you look at China, some argue 60%. Employ half of those who are in the workforce. So there is quite a big difference. Is that what Russia is trying to do right now?
Yes, I think the Russian administration is doing its best to bring not only the reliance on natural resources and state enterprises down, but also to foster the opportunity for small businesses. And that's not only growing the percentage of the economy that's driven by small business, but that's also bringing a lot of these small businesses that historically may have been what we call black or cash businesses, and bringing them into the visible economy.
Very interesting. Tell me one or two examples. That sounds very much similar to China, it seems, some 10 years ago. Campbell.
And I think some of these steps have been perhaps modeled on China's steps to bring its own economy into the light. But historically, many small businesses, Russian laws are very complicated. They change and evolve very quickly. Regulations can be very difficult to follow for small businesses. That's one of the areas that our businesses try to help small businesses, make them more efficient and productive. But historically, it was much easier for small businesses to make their payments in cash, receive their payments in cash, pay their employees, and that's both getting more challenging and less appealing, with higher penalties and better tools to bring them into the light.
And China, of course, it's already, I guess, some step forward compared to what Russia is today. If you look at Alibaba, if you look at all these financial apps and all the innovation.
I think in that area, China is ahead than many countries, including developed countries, because no country has such a large millennial population, over 200 million. And secondly, younger Chinese are just more tech savvy and more willing to embrace new technology and also risk-taking culture in China. China is way ahead than many countries.
You know, we talk a lot about business, but none of these businesses is of no business to the geopolitics that we are seeing today. The world is changing fast. Both of you understand what I'm talking about. We see so many things going on right now. While the St. Petersburg Economic Conference is going on, Chinese Premier is visiting Europe, talking to the EU leaders, talking to German Chancellor. While at the same time, earlier interactions between Russia and the EU countries, Russia and France and United States, Russia in different ways. So we don't know where the future direction of politics will be. What would that mean for Russia, for example, when its economy is just rebounding?
I think the economic crisis that has been apparent over the last couple of years, as we're discussing, we see that starting to rebound. I think what I feel and what I hear from the marketplace is that the sentiment has recovered very much since the beginning of this year. but the real economic data is yet to actually follow. So people are feeling better, so therefore they're spending a little more, but I think companies, and especially the clients of our businesses, don't yet feel that it's really starting to rise. I think the stability, the strong guidance of the central bank, stable monetary and I think foreign policy, and I know Russia has disagreements with many of its neighbors and obviously with the West, but the more that those things can be stable, then the more that the business environment here, both large and small, can grow steadily.
But I guess uncertainty is exactly what Russia is facing right now, both geopolitically and also when it comes to internal reform. Remember President Putin, before he was in power for the very first term as the president, he's talking about 20 years revival of Russia. Well, that clock is kicking, I guess, for now.
I think notwithstanding all this uncertainty and permutations on geopolitical chessboard, but a few things I think we know for sure. One thing is global growth will remain quite slow going forward. Secondly, protectionism is on the rise. That's something we know. And thirdly, I think for Russia, they need to look for alternatives. I think that's why you need.
What do you mean by alternatives?
Well, alternative meaning alternative growth model in China and collaboration with China, and of course broadening collaboration beyond energy resources sector, so on and so forth.
Do you think that could be the way? Do you think that is really happening right now?
I think that there has been a lot, at least in the Russian media, I can't speak for the Chinese media, that has been made a lot about potential Russian and Chinese partnerships. I think locally many of the views are that is currently almost a marriage of convenience. Russia is a resource-rich country. China needs a lot of resources. And as we just mentioned, for this to have real long-lasting economic benefit, then that cooperation needs to be deepened dramatically to a lot more spheres than simply natural resources.
But what exactly is the nature between these two countries? Are they competitors or are they real coordinators? We have seen some parallel ideas. China's Belt and Road Initiative. Russia has this Eurasian Economic Corridor. China thinking about reaching out to the West and also incorporating other elements. Russia seems to have very similar ideas. Think about the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. So what are the natures now of these two countries?
Well, I mean, you can have, you can compete, you can cooperate. You don't have to have this black and white relationship. The fact matter is right now we have some institutional arrangement, whether through financial institutions or through Shanghai Cooperative. So I would say relation becoming more entrenched. Secondly, I would say China is also changing her views. So for example, Belt and Road. It's no longer just this a static 63 country. It's really about a greater commitment for opening up economy and trade, liberalization, integration, so on and so forth. So I think Russia is taking a more relaxed view towards the Belt and Road.
Does Russia feel being left behind? Because China pretty much is in the front line right now.
Well, I think China obviously has huge economic and has a lot of, should we say, population growth and inherent growth to put its muscle behind many of these initiatives. I think as relates to the One Belt, One Road initiative, there are certainly benefits that can bring to Russia, but obviously Russia also has concerns. How does that relate into countries that Russia feels perhaps are in their backyard or in their neighborhood? And there will be, of course, ways to cooperate, and there are the potential for conflict, but that requires, should we say, a maturing of relations to make the optimum.
Maturing of relations, final point, very briefly, Rush. Sitao, what about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think both sides need to understand, not just money cannot buy everything.
Xu Sitao, Chief Economist of Deloitte, China, and also Campbell Basswaite, Managing Partner of Finteca Holding here in Russia. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you, really appreciate it. And Zoe, back to you from our live broadcast here in St. Petersburg at the 21st St. Petersburg International Economic Forum.
And there's more covering along the day. Thank you very much, Tian Wei. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. Just type World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or you can check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. And from everyone here on World Insight team, thanks for watching. And please tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Goodbye.